What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the series. This is Tim Wright, and we are going to dive into different submarkets around Atlanta and sort of the Spotify rewind, if you want to call it, what's going on in our city. So if you're not familiar, Atlanta has 7 major submarkets. We're going to focus on 5 or 6 of those today. We've got downtown, we've got Midtown, we've got Buckhead, Central Perimeter, Cumberland Galleria, and then the Georgia 400 market. We could also talk about Northeast, but that's such a spread out market. You could talk about, a bunch of different pockets there. And then we've got the airport. But what we're going to focus on today are those initial ones that I mentioned. We're going to dive into downtown. This is one of my favorite submarkets. It's where I cut my teeth and started my career. My office was at 30 Ivan Allen, and I literally have my bike parked in the deck, and I would jump on my bike and go canvas buildings and was just kind of swimming in it for a while. It's a very historic and dense submarket. Right now, it's the receiver of more private and public investment than pretty much anywhere in the country. And we're gonna dive into some of those stories and what makes 2024 so significant for this submarket. First off, we're talking about office conversions. Central Atlanta Progress put out an RFP about a year or so ago, and they finally came out with some results. They said, hey, here's 10 or 11 buildings that we think would be pretty good conversion candidates, if you want to use that word. There's a lot of office buildings out there. People are like, what do we do with this thing? People aren't using it. The 2 that really came up most in conversation this year were Georgia Pacific and then 2 Peachtree. Georgia Pacific went to all their third-party tenants earlier this year, basically said, you need to get out. We're going to do something with this building. Nobody knew what it was that they were going to do. We were like, is it a hotel? Is it? But they came out and said 400 apartments. That's our goal. That's our plan. Now get out. And then the other one I want to talk about is 2 Peachtree. The city purchased this a couple years ago, and they've been in a lot of the kind of prelim design and planning of what are we going to do with it and how many units can we put in. There were some reports that came out that the project will cost close to $400 million, which seems like a lot. Maybe they can get some help from the federal government and other funding sources. It's a huge building right in the middle of downtown and would be a really good project for that pocket. Next up, I want to talk about Centennial Yards. We did a whole video on this. You can click on this link and get a full hard hat tour if you want. But the most notable thing here is they topped out on the Mitchell, which is the apartment building. And most recently, they gave it its title, the Phoenix. This is the new hotel that's just topped out. So first time in, 100 years that the train gulch actually has a crane and there's new building happening. There's been, I don't know how many developers. There was a story that came out. There's probably 20 developers that have tried to develop the Gulch, and it's finally happening. So if you haven't been to a United game or Falcons game recently, you'll see these 2 buildings. We'll show you a shot right here. This is what I'm talking about. Okay, the last up is the Stitch. There were 3 of these projects going on between Hub 404, Midtown Connector, and the Stitch. These are highway capping mega projects, and somehow we have 3 of them in conversation right now. The most realistic one, and one that's probably has the most legs, is the Stitch. This is right in downtown. It connects Midtown and downtown together. They just came out with the draft master plan just a couple days before we're filming this now. And they have funding. They have to spend this money by 2026. They're expecting to be done by 2030, which is all really exciting news. Now, on the office standpoint, notable transactions, we've got KPMG. They did a renewal for about 100,000 feet at Truist Plaza. We have the Hawks. They did a renewal for 2 floors at 101 Marietta or Centennial Tower. And then last up, I'm not a fan. We put Bank of America in downtown just because the North Ave is where we cut off that submarket. But Eversheds Sutherland signed a 100,000 square foot lease at Bank of America right before the end of the year. So all really exciting things. All right, let's move on from downtown. We're gonna talk about Midtown. This has been the darling submarket of Atlanta for about 20 years. There's been more development here than anywhere else. I'll show you a picture. This is something that Midtown Alliance put out. All the highlighted buildings are recently developed buildings or things that are to come. It's just nuts. It's an unrecognizable part of the city if the last time we were here was in the 90s. Some of the things I want to point out here from this past year, there are a ton of new buildings that have popped up. We talked about this in the past video that are kind of struggling to get leased up. They're beautiful buildings, but the demand for new product is not as strong as maybe as it was a couple years ago. Again, we're not going to name any buildings, but that's just a very real thing that's happening in Midtown right now. The next thing I'll say is the overall leasing activity in Midtown it's just always been extremely strong. But this year it was beat. Central Perimeter had more leasing than Midtown. Midtown was like 1.2 million and Central Perimeter was like right under 1.3. So pretty neck and neck, but it's very notable that Midtown was outpunched this past year. Some notable transactions here were Atlanta Gaslight. They leased about 250,000 feet. And then the other is Piedmont Healthcare, which we talked about in the first video, that's going over to Atlantic Station. You're gonna see a nice new Piedmont Healthcare logo on that building pretty soon. Some other things, we could go into West Atlanta and then Old Fourth Ward. Those both deserve their own videos. What you know about Old Fourth Ward is the vacancy is extremely low. A lot of that product is still doing really, really well. And then rent growth, most of the rent growth that happened in Atlanta was in Midtown. And how Cushman, how we track things, this is more on the asking rate as opposed to where deals are getting signed and comps. That's just how we do it. It's just however you want to track it. But we're starting to see new developments quoting close to $70 a foot, which we've just never seen before. So that's it. That's Midtown for you. Let's go on to Buckhead. Now, Buckhead, this is the home of financial services, law firms, and family offices. Some of the significant transactions we saw were South State Bank. They moved over to prominence. You're going to see a nice little South State Bank logo on that building. That was for about 90,000 square feet. Two others that were really notable. Morris Manning Martin has been at the Atlanta Financial Center for almost 40 years. And a Cushman team here was able to represent them and move them over to 2 Alliance. That's for a long-term lease of about 100,000 feet. Another sign. You're going to put Morris Manning Martin logo right on 2 Alliance, which would be a good look. And then last, we talked about this in the first video. AT&T took about 300,000 feet at Lenox Park. So those are your significant transactions for Buckhead. Okay, now we'll talk about some of the notable things that happened. Atlanta Financial Center is one to be on the lookout for. This is a building that's been pretty leased for a long time. There was a pretty disastrous crowdfunding project that happened. You can read more about that at this link. But between Truist moving up to the Battery and then Morris Manning Martin, as I just mentioned, moving out, the building is projected to be about 40% occupied in the next couple of years. This will be a really interesting thing to watch as a new owner can acquire this property and do something different with it. Most of you probably don't know, I didn't know this growing up in Atlanta, but Georgia 400 was built after Atlanta Financial Center. We'll show a picture of that here. They dug under that building to make the highway, which I think is just mind-blowing. I don't know what building we're going to dig under next to build a highway, but that's something to keep an eye out for in Buckhead. Okay, the last thing I'll point out for Buckhead is Buckhead Plaza. This place has seen more rent growth than almost anywhere in Buckhead. It's always been around 40 bucks a foot. This project, it's getting closer to $60 a foot now. We joke that it's 110% leased. We did a whole video on Buckhead Plaza. There's kind of a wait list to get in it. It's just become sort of a country club building where you get to see all your friends. Great project. There's a new Del Bar that just moved in, and you got in-town golf and a lot of stuff. So I'd say Buckhead Plaza was a real winner in Buckhead this past year. Let's move on. Talk about Central Perimeter. I mentioned this earlier. Central Perimeter had the most leases signed in any submarket over this past year. They were able to do just under 1.3 million square feet of leasing, which just beat Midtown. It's amazing. Notable transactions, AIG leased almost 180,000 square feet at Perimeter Summit. Also at Perimeter Summit, Zaxby's leased 52,000 feet. And then last up, Newell Brands, something we mentioned in the past video, they signed about 180,000 feet at the Queen Building. Those are your big transactions. The topic of conversation in Central Perimeter is the sublease inventory. We did a whole report. You can download that on our link tree. Cox has about 1 million square feet of sublease space up in that submarket. There's a lot of inventory, just a lot of activity, a lot of everything. Big developments that happened there. High Street finally delivered. This is an amazing kind of live, work, play thing right in the middle, right on the edge of Dunwoody, right in the middle of Central Perimeter. There's Putt Shack, about 150,000 square feet of retail. Notably, the office product has not leased anything yet. Hopefully we'll see some of that in 2025. The last thing I'll say, State Farm, they had this huge campus. There's a last parcel that was slated to have more office product, but there was some zoning. There was an article that came out about the zoning changing from office over to apartments, some hotel, and way less office space that was originally slated. Okay, so that's Central Perimeter for you. Let's go over to Cumberland Galleria. It's the home of the Braves Stadium. This stat blew me away when we were doing the research for this. The Galleria was responsible for 53% of all leasing done in Cumberland in 2023. Now, the Galleria is only 18% of that submarket. So their market share is just crazy. What happened in 2024, that trend continued. They had 37% of all leasing activity in Cumberland. Some significant transactions, Manhattan & Associates renewed for almost 200,000 feet. First Key Homes moved into Galleria for 50,000 feet. And then GE Vernova, which is a subsidiary of General Electric, moved into Galleria for 77,000 feet. Some of what we talked about with Buckhead Plaza, similar phenomenon. The building gets leased up and then the rents go through the roof. Galleria has always been around 30 bucks a foot. They're starting to quote over 40 now. I was just looking online right before we started filming this. They're at 41.75 of a quoted rate, just pretty wild, but it just speaks to the demand. People want to be around activity. They like Galleria. They like that it's near the ballpark. It's a great spot. Some other things I'll note about the Cumberland Galleria area, the Truist office that's getting put in right next to the ballpark, that is set to deliver in Q2 of this year. Really exciting. And then the other thing is the condo tower is making some great progress right outside of the Battery. There was an old office building that was 1000 Circle 75. They tore it down and there's a new building coming. So, all right, let's round it out. We've got one more submarket to talk about. This is Georgia 400, or if you want to call it North Fulton. This is a submarket that's full of a lot of what we call commodity office buildings. A lot of owners have done tons to try and beef these buildings up and make them stand out from each other. They've got nice amenity halls and new grab-and-go food and stuff. But it's the Avalon effect. What's happened up there, we've got right around the Avalon, right off of 400, office rates are getting pushed up to $50 a foot. Even buildings across the street from the Avalon are getting into the mid-40s. People want to be there. You go less than a mile, and you go on the other side of 400 and your rate drops below $30 a foot. So the Avalon effect is real and it's still in full force up of the Georgia 400 corridor. I'll note any space that comes online at Avalon gets leased up pretty quickly. It's just a very desirable area. Some of the notable transactions that happen up in North Fulton, we've got Nolan Transportation. They leased about 60,000 square feet. That was a renewal at Founders. We've got Site One Landscape. That was a Cushman represented deal at Mansell Overlook 300 for a little over 50,000 feet. And then FM Global, which was a new deal that was over at Avalon, just to the point earlier of a ton of demand there. That was for over 50,000 square feet. The last thing I'll say on Georgia 400, something I'm really excited about is Mark Toro's The Medley. This is a new development that has been talked about for some time. It's an old campus that is going to get a nice facelift. And Johns Creek's going to have its own version of the Avalon, if you want to call it that. So that breaks ground this year, and it's really exciting for that area. So that's it. Those are your updates on every one of the major submarkets here in Atlanta. If you have any questions on any of these, we're happy to help. We can send you some info. We come out with a ton of reports. If you're interested in any of those, you can click this link, go to our link tree. This next year, we've got a lot planned, a lot of videos coming. If you have any questions about major developments, or if you'd like to see a certain project covered, we'd love to hear from you. Please be sure to like, subscribe, do all the things that people tell you to do, click the bell, all that. And we just appreciate you sticking around for this long. And yeah, until next time.